you tonight? Good? Can hear me? Great. So thank you all for coming out tonight. As Miss Ann said, my name is Lauren Virgo. I'm the director of the Aiken County Historical Museum. I grew up just down the road in North Augusta. Went to North Augusta schools. It went to Clemson for undergraduate. Go Tigers. Where are my Tigers at? Where are my Tigers? Okay, good. Woo! I'm in. Dude!
They canceled
I know
out.
that's true.
They canceled out in North Augusta.
Oh, gotcha. But and then I went on to get my graduate studies at USC. So I became a Gamecock in the later years, although, you know, the ring I wear says Clemson right here. My dad said the most painful thing was writing a check for tuition to USC. So he was like, oh. It was so difficult for him. My dad always said when we were growing up, my brother and I, he would say, you can go to any college you want to, but the check is going to Clemson. So like, yes, sir. But I got my degrees in history, and then I got my degrees in museum studies, and I've been at the Aiken County Historical Museum now for about 9 years. And I've had about 21 years in the museum field, and all of it in this area, so I'm glad to be here tonight talking about our shared history. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that this is the second time I've given this talk, and Tina over here is recording me. And so if I make a mistake, just put subtitles that says Lauren is wrong. The date is actually. So please forgive me if I make a hiccup or a mistake. And if you know better, then just come up to me afterwards and be like, Lauren, you got this wrong. I'll be like, okay, thank you. But I try to be as accurate as possible. I try to read as many sources as possible. And at the end of this presentation, I'll kind of cite a lot of my sources so that if you want to go digging further or know where I found what I found, then you have that resource for yourself. But what I would like to do, of course, being America's 250th anniversary this year, the museum is pulling together a Aiken County during the American Revolution exhibit. It's going to be up in our museum temporarily throughout the months of July and August, and we're excited to bring that. And as part of my research into that, I thought I would also create a presentation to come out and speak to groups about what was going on here in our Aiken County area during the American Revolution. And I have to say, it's all around us, but not entirely within Aiken County. So you'll see me kind of go out to different areas for stories, just to kind of hit where the action was happening. But I will, of course, feature Aiken County as well. So let's get in. Oh, and at the very end of my talk, Miss Jennifer Burkhalter back there, who is wonderfully dressed in attire, that is your patriotic homespun, is how you refer to it. Yeah. She's going to come and talk about the DAR, and specifically you're with the Trenton Chapter, is that right? So she's going to come up and after and talk about how if you want to become more involved with American Revolutionary War history in our area, either through the sons of the American Revolution or the daughters of the American Revolution, she'll give a little talk about that. And then we'll have a special talker right after her. So, I wonder what, Miss Ann? Yeah, be prepared. All right, so let's get going. I always like to preface that, of course, this talk is about Aiken County during the American Revolution, but technically Aiken County didn't exist. Aiken County did not exist until 1871. We were created during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. What was here beforehand was what we call the New Windsor Township. And so most of what I'm going to be speaking to tonight occurred just around or just outside of the New Windsor Township. Now, Aiken County was cut from 4 counties. It was cut from Edgefield, Barnwell, Lexington, and Orangeburg. And majorly it was chopped out of Edgefield and Barnwell. In fact, the part of North Augusta that I grew up in was the Edgefield side. And so we're all sort of blended into those territories from back then. But like I said, New Windsor Township is primarily where we're going to focus tonight. We'll go a little bit up into 96 and a little bit across the river. So this is the New Windsor Township. You can see the dotted lines here, running from Galphin's Mill all the way up to the head of the Salt Catchers, which is the Salkehatchie, up to Horse Creek, and down to the ruins of Drake's Fort. And the ruins of Drake's Fort always mystified me. I was like, who is a Drake and why was this fort up there and why was it in ruins? Because this map was made in 1775 and there's already a fort in ruins. So if you want to know more about that, ask me after the talk. It's a neat little story. And then of course you've got the city of Augusta here. But New Windsor Township, that's kind of the outlines that it was. And that's pretty much about what Aiken County takes up today. Now, who was in New Windsor Township? This always surprised me when I was doing the research because it's not who I expected. Early on, the first documented Native Americans in our area were documented in the 1660s by Dr. Henry Woodward, and that's the Westo tribe. And the Westo, if y'all have ever been to the Westaboo Festival over in Augusta, that's Westaboo means Westo River. So that's in honor of the first Native American tribe who was documented here by Europeans. Next came the Savannah, which is probably why we have the Savannah River instead of the Westaboo River that we live on. Then you have the Appalachians and the Chickasaw. And I always have to include this note just because I'm really a child at heart and it makes me laugh. But instead of having a chieftain for the Chickasaw, if you were the chieftain, you were called the Squirrel King. And I'm like, I love it. Because if you think about it, those squirrels are devious and tricky, and they'll get into every bird feeder no matter if you put peanut butter or springs or cones, they're going to get into it. And so when you think about it, you're like, okay, Squirrel King, that's a good title because you've got to be feisty and devious and all kinds of things. So who out there would like to be a Squirrel King? No one? Okay, good. Thank you. You got selected to be Squirrel King. So you've been nominated from the crowd. Yeah. And of course, who are the people who are immigrating to our area? So you have the Swiss, the Irish, the British, and the African people who were brought with the British. Who all is trading and what are they trading? Well, the Native Americans are trading at Fort Moore or Galphin. They're trading corn, deer hides, tobacco, guns, metals, and beads. So there's a lot of trade going on early because when you look at it, the Savannah River comes up from the Atlantic Ocean, and then right about where we are, you hit a geological fall line. And that fall line creates rapids. It's literally where the land falls away. And so when you're coming up the Savannah River, you hit those rapids and you can't go any further inland. So we become an inland port. That's why we make such a wonderful trading zone, because everybody could offload here, collect trade, and then go back down the Savannah River. So we became very important in the Rapids area to early colonial development and what they called at the time the backcountry. So, like I said, I was really surprised that Beach Island's history, the first major immigrant culture were the Swiss, and these were German-speaking Swiss. What happened is, early on, of course, the owners of the Carolinas are the Lord's proprietors. They're given the Carolinas to develop. Well, not too many of the Lord proprietors ever developed much of anything here. In fact, I think only one of them ever came over to the American colonies. And so eventually the British government seemed to have reached their limit with the Lord's proprietors, waiting for them to develop the backcountry of the Carolinas and push the frontier. So the British get the land from the Lord's proprietors, and they start developing townships, and within those townships, you're given free land. So if you immigrate from Europe, where they're sending all these pamphlets and advertisements, you come over here, you're given a certain acreage of land, which could be 500, 200, or 1,000 acres. You're given a year's worth of supplies. You're given advice and travel and things like that from Europe. And this sounds really appealing to these Swiss citizens who lived in a town called Appenzell. They are under religious persecution in their own town, and so they decide to come to America to this free land for religious freedom and for the free land that they were giving away. So the gentleman who sort of leads the group and becomes their leader here is John Tobler. They moved to the area in 1747 with 200 Swiss citizens, And okay, just because I have to do an aside, because again, I have the mind of a child. I love that his last name is Tobler, and that reminds me of the German chocolate Toblerone. And I'm like, we came this close to having a chocolate factory in Beach Island. Dang it! I would have loved that. I would have visited that chocolate factory all the time. But John Tobler becomes basically like the pitch guy. So he and his 200 citizens have come over here and settled, and they want to bring more people here to settle. So he, about 8 years into living here, writes an almanac, an article for an almanac that gets sent over to Switzerland and Germany area. And he's telling people, look, we got it great over here. You guys need to come over here too. And so he says in the pamphlet that our area, the climate of the province is neither too warm, bullcrap, sorry, nor too cold, therefore quite benevolent and agreeable. So I think, you know, there were no rules back then against false advertisement and libel and things like that, so he could get away with saying that it was neither too warm. And then he goes on to say that everything in New Windsor that is planted grows quite well and yields much fruit, which along with trade makes this place famous. Did y'all know you were famous? Yeah. So here he is being a pitchman basically for development in this back country of South Carolina. Now, the reason that the British want to develop our area so much is because of that, what do they call it, arable land. It's very plentiful for planting. And so the British want people to encourage them to come here, create agricultural lands, and create trade products that they can ship. What's interesting is I kept thinking, you know, a lot of what we hear growing up and going to school is that most of the American Revolution was fought in the Northeast. Not so much. There was a whole other Southern campaign starting in 1779. So why? Why do we hear about Lexington and Concord and the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, but we don't often hear about the fighting of Kings Mountain or Camden or things like that? It was much later in the war, but it was a tactic. So during the American Revolution, you have the British Empire realizing that the war isn't going as well as they thought it would in the Northeast. So they decide to shift. And what they're going to hope to get away from the war with is at least Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Georgia colonies. If they can walk away with just those 4 colonies at the end of the war, they're golden. They can let the colonists have the Northeast. Why? Because by 1770, South Carolina's exports were 29% of the value of British imports. One little colony was 29% of British imports. When you add in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, you're up to almost 50% of the entire British import economy is coming from those 4 states. That's why we're so valuable to the British Empire. Plus, King George thought that since, hey, he's given away all this land starting in the 1740s, especially in South Carolina, people would be loyal to him. They had just been given all this free land and helping start. Freedom of religion. Of course they're going to be loyal to him. So he expected North Carolina and South Carolina especially that we would be on his side. And that was a more winnable war tactic here. The southern coastlines are easy to navigate. We don't have the rocky shores of the Northeast. So our ports are easier to blockade or defend or attack. So our coastlines are much more vulnerable. They also wanted, like I said, at least the southern colonies to come away with those to keep the wealth of its empire. Plus there were many strategic British victories, including they got Charleston, they got Savannah, and they got Camden. So they've already won these locations and have them blockaded for the British in our area. So what they didn't anticipate, though, is that Southerners you know, being that we're Southerners, we're stubborn and hard-headed, and we don't say, yes sir, come on in and take over our town. We fight back. And so specifically, we fought in what they called at the time the partisan way, what we would know more today like guerrilla warfare. This is where your swamp fox comes into play. So we don't line up like the troops would have at Concord and Lexington. We're fighting from the swamps and from the woodlands. So they don't quite expect our fighting tactic. Oh, I gotta show you all something real quick. Okay, so in the museum display, we have some colonial dollars, and they're really Spanish milled dollars because, of course, we weren't going to take British money at the time, so we did Spanish milled dollars. And what I love is, like, South Carolinians, we're petty. And so on our money, we're going to put this, a symbol of a burning ship, and we're going to put this, a symbol of a palmetto tree. And that's one of the first times you really see the palmetto tree associated with South Carolina. Now, why is the palmetto tree so important, and why are we putting it on our money to give a kind of to the British Empire? The palmetto tree saved us, right?
Yeah, cannonball wouldn't go through it.
Exactly. So when they were building forts along the coastline to defend against the British Navy, they didn't use oak and pine trees that might have exploded when a cannonball hit them. They used palmetto trees. And the palmetto trees are very fibrous, so when the cannonball was shot at them, it absorbed instead of exploded. So the palmetto tree became a winning symbol of South Carolina. We put it on our money, and we put it on our flags. The other thing we have up here is a burning ship. So it actually says on here, I can't read Latin very well, but basically it tells the story of the Actaeon. The Actaeon was a British ship, and it had beached itself accidentally during a battle. And the British did not want their ship to fall into Patriot hands, so rather than let us have the ship and all the supplies on it, they burned it. And so we put the picture of their defeat and the fact that they had to burn their own ship on our money. And again, that's sort of like a we're very petty people, but brilliant. So, like I said, we don't have a whole lot of battles going on in our area. The biggies are Camden or Kings Mountain or Charleston or Savannah. But what we do have are sieges. And so we have two very famous sieges in our area. The first one is the Battle of Augusta, or the Siege of Augusta. It starts in May of 1781, and it's really because at that time the British had taken Augusta, and we were fighting to get it back. The Battle of 96, just up the road, that was another major conflict, again in May of 1781, and we're going to delve into that a little bit. But those are the two closest to our area. Augusta falls to the British. So the city of Augusta was founded in 1733, of course named for Princess Augusta. So we are royalty. Did you know that? North Augustans, we are. Oh. So somebody earlier asked if I would like the name Queen Elizabeth, and I was like, yeah, I'll take it. So, or Queen Augusta. I'll take Princess Augusta, Queen Augusta. So city of Augusta was founded in 1736, and it becomes prosperous. By the late 1700s, there are over 100 buildings in the city. Most of it's clustered where today there's the St. Paul's Episcopal Church and there's 5th Street and 3rd Street. That's about where the original city of Augusta was. The citizens were very divided between Whig and Tory. And I always thought we should be called the Tories, the Patriot side, because I just can't think of us as Whigs because I automatically think of people donning those powdered wigs back in the day. And I'm just like, couldn't we have been like Tories so we didn't have to wear wigs? But anyways, so we're the uncool name. We're the Whigs. The Patriots are. And it's very divided. But people are starting to have sort of skirmishes in the street. And one of those skirmishes is going to come back to bite us. Because in 1779, no, so sorry, I believe it was 1776 or 1777, there was like you hear the Sons of Liberty in the Northeast, there was in Augusta something called the Boys of Liberty. And they one day went to a gentleman named Thomas Brown, who was a wealthy merchant in the Augusta area. They knew he was a loyalist. They pulled him out of a friend's house and they tarred and feathered him. And as we know, that is boiling hot tar on the skin and then feathers put on you. He left town, went towards Savannah, which at that time was under British hands, very bitter, very angry. He gets commissioned into the British Army, and he comes back as Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brown, to retake his former city away from the Patriots. So what did they see when they come here for the Siege of Augusta? The Siege of Augusta takes about 3 weeks, May 22nd to June 5th of 1781, so again towards the end of the war. We called it Fort Augusta, but the British love to change our names as soon as they capture something. So we turned from Fort Augusta to Fort Cornwallis under the British hands. I know, right? Name change, come on, really petty. So, but Fort Cornwallis was constructed by the British near St. Paul's Church. This is kind of what we think it looked like right here with the church outside. And during the Siege of Augusta, the Patriot force that comes across from South Carolina is under the leadership of Colonel Elijah Clark with the Patriot force. He joins up with Andrew Pickens and Major General Light Horse Harry Lee, who of course we know his son was Robert E. Lee. Exactly, two very famous men from two very famous wars. So they arrive on the outskirts of Augusta in May 21st of 1781 with an estimated 1,600 men. Inside Fort Cornwallis and just above them Fort Greer was around 630 men. Now, I always thought growing up that meant there were 630 British soldiers. No. There was probably a handful of British soldiers, and under them were loyalists from the area. So this is a neighbor fighting neighbor, cousin fighting cousin, brother fighting brother war. This is the original Civil War. These men are fighting against one another for different versions of the country. Now, the Patriot forces that arrive know that they cannot get through the walls and the barricades of Fort Cornwallis or Fort Augusta. So what they build is called a mayhem tower. And maybe I'm saying that wrong, but I like saying mayhem because it makes me think of mayhem, and it's like, you know it's going to cause trouble. So the mayhem tower was developed by a gentleman named Mayhem, and basically it is a wooden structure that you build until it's higher than the walls when you shoot down of the fort you're trying to get into. And so with the Mayhem Tower being built right outside of Fort Augusta, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brown tries different ways of burning it down or stopping its construction because he knows once it's finished, he's finished. So he sends out people to light it on fire. He fires at them to try and kill the gentlemen who are building it. All kinds of ways to stop its construction because finally it's finished construction on June 1st, and within 4 days Fort Cornwallis falls to the Patriot forces.
We didn't have no Chickasaw Indians out of Horse Creek Valley helping out.
Not that I know of. Although I've got to ask Milledge a little bit more about that because there's a little bit of something I'll get into in just a little bit about the Native Americans that were around here. With the return of Augusta to the Patriot forces, the British troops leave for Savannah. They get bottled up in Savannah. And then finally, the British completely evacuate Savannah in 1782. So that's the Siege of Augusta. The town's of 96, just up the road. So it's the intersection of 12 roads, and there were 2 major towns and a trading post there. It's kind of near modern-day Greenwood, and in fact, nowadays it's a national park, and I went there a couple months ago, and it's just lovely. So if you ever have a chance, go on up to 96 and go to the national park. This town was very divided, leaning more towards the Loyalist side. These were recent German immigrants to the area and French immigrants to the area. The Germans sided with the Loyalists, the French tended to side with the Patriots. So, not only are they fighting each other though, but they're also fighting the Cherokee. They are on the borderlands with the Native American tribe, and some large factions of the Cherokee had been won over by the British, who said, after the war, we'll respect your boundaries, and we'll give you all these ammunitions and guns and things like that for you to keep. So they were sort of giving them gifts and giving them assurances to fight against the Patriots. So here we have Colonel Nathaniel Greene, or Continental General, sorry, Nathaniel Greene, who has decided that 96 is his turning point. And he's going to come into South Carolina and make this where they make their stand. And here's the Battle of 96. So 96 is actually unique in the way that it was developed as a star fort. So you can see what it would have looked like back then, and then what it looks like today. So when you go there, you can still see the ruins of that original star fort, and it's really cool. This is one of the, well, it starts on May 22nd and runs until June 19th of 1781. This is the longest siege of the entire American Revolution. It's between 1,500 patriots and only 550 loyalists. And again, these loyalists are locals. These are people who used to trade with each other, who would know each other, who are now fighting against each other on opposite sides of the war. There were about 2 or 3 British officers who were there to sort of lead the loyalists and guide them in different military ways, but for the most part, they were all colonial Americans. What's interesting is even though we have 1,500 patriots and only 550 loyalists, that star fort protects them like nobody else. The patriots simply cannot get close enough to break down the walls. And there's even a trench that the British have so that they can get supplies from the town. And they have water. That is the key component to being able to last that long in a siege. They have access to water, they have access to resources, they have access to food. They can outlast those patriots. And they're waiting for backup. The British were supposed to be coming within the week of June 19th to back up the loyalists and protect them. So originally what General Nathaniel Greene decides is, well, we can't use the traditional methods of breaking into the star fort, so we're going to tunnel. So they started digging a zigzag trench all their way up to the star fort with the goal of getting as close as they could and then leaping out and attacking. Now, of course, as they're building this trench, men in the Patriot Force do die from being shot at. But slowly but surely, they're building this zigzag tunnel. It's getting closer and closer. But then Nathaniel Greene gets word that the British forces are only days away from being there at 96 to give support to the Loyalists. So Nathaniel Greene knows, now or never. So they know they have the zigzag tunnel as close to the star fort as they can get it at that point. And so what they do is they funnel the men in, they jump out of the tunnels and the trenches and attack. At some point, the Patriots are taking the surge and they're getting into the fort, and then they get repulsed. And then they go in again and they take the fort, and then they get repulsed. And finally, it comes to a draw. Neither side truly wins, but the Loyalists know that they've lost their advantage, they've lost the hold in this area, and they retreat. And for the Patriots, it's a win. So Nathaniel Greene is able to move on after June 19th and declare that area sort of, I guess, won for all intents and purposes because the Loyalists have fled. So those were the 2 major sieges that occurred in our area, and again, towards the end of the war, but led to essentially Patriot victories in those areas. Now, what actually happened in Aiken County? There were a few skirmishes in our area. If you go to sc250.com, which is the state's website for all things American Revolution, they list a lot of these battles. One of them is Hammond's Mill in North Augusta. As Milledge knows, the Hammonds were all over North Augusta, what we would call North Augusta today. There was Samuel Leroy, and I love that he spelled his name capital L, little e, capital R, O-Y, which is just like, I am the king, I am Leroy. And so I have to say it that way. But Leroy Hammond, Samuel Hammond, all of these guys are in the area fighting. So Colonel Leroy Hammond and Colonel Thomas Key, they fight the Loyalists over a local mill, and of course they push them out because a mill at that time was a strategic point of water and a food source, or food processing source. Milledge ancestor is George Galphin, and Fort Galphin is another point of a skirmish. Again, as the Patriots are going up to Augusta to lead into the siege of Augusta, they first go through Fort Galphin. Fort Galphin was being held by the British, and I love it, again, when the British take over our forts, they rename them. It was no longer Fort Galphin at that point, it was Fort Dreadnought. You can just imagine them saying that, like, we'll put the fear in them, we'll call it Dreadnought. So it's Fort Dreadnought, which you can still see the remains of today at the Silver Bluff Audubon Sanctuary. So if you have a chance, go down there and check out the archaeological dig and the research they have there. It was just a short 2-day skirmish. Light Horse Harry Lee, there's some stories that he wasn't there, but he was in charge of the charge or the skirmish. There are some say that he'd already gone on to fight elsewhere and left his group behind. But being as it may, Fort Galphin was reclaimed by the Patriots, and then they moved on to the Siege of Augusta. While they were there, they got 100, so it was Light Horse Harry Lee and Colonel Leroy Hammond versus 180 soldiers, militiamen, loyalists, and Native Americans. So I was talking with Milledge before my talk tonight because there's some letters that have been digitized from the 1700s during the American Revolution, and they're written by George Galphin to some of the Patriot higher-ups. And he's writing to them saying, look, the Native Americans around Silver Bluff are on our side for now. I really need you to send me munitions, I need you to send me metal, I need you to send me basically gifts that I can give to the Native Americans that I have relationships with to keep them on the Patriot side. And so this correspondence goes back and forth because the British were also, again, offering bribes, offering assurances. If you come fight on our side, all these things will happen for you after the war. So I can't figure out just quite if the Native Americans stayed on our side in the Silver Bluff area. But it seems from the correspondence, at least at the time, they were, for the moment, on our side.
I can share a little bit.
Sure.
There was Lauren's been talking about who was fighting who. And at the same time, the Native Americans were here. And we know the type of fighting that was done up north. And we know the type of guerrilla type fighting that the Patriots were doing down here. But you don't want Indians in the fight because of the way they fight. But the British wanted very badly to have the Native Americans to fight on their side. There was an Indian agent, we're going to talk about two Indian agents, but one Indian agent was a guy by the name of John Stewart, and John Stewart reported directly to Lord Cornwallis. The goal was get the Indians fighting on our side. George Galphin became the Indian agents for the Continental Congress, and he reported directly to Henry Lawrence. Now, who was Henry Lawrence? He's from South Carolina, but he's kind of like the Vice President of the United States, because John Hancock was the President of the Continental Congress. George Washington reported to him, and Henry Lawrence was the Vice President. In fact, he took over for John Hancock after John Hancock left. So Stewart and Galphin are going back and forth trying to convince the Indians either fight, and Galphin, who really, his role was, he was almost like a white Indian, because for so long he had children by slaves, he had children by Creek Indians, and he became very loyal to the Patriots. A lot of the Indian agents did not, because they really had been in relationship with the British forever. You know, I mean, that's where they got their goods and trade with the Indians. But I've got my reasons, many reasons, why George Galphin was a patriot, and he really was. And his main role, I think, was working for the Continental Congress to keep the Indians out of the fight. And it took a little bribery, as Lauren said, more than a little bribery. You had to do all kind of things to keep them out, but that's my words.
And so Fort Galphin, even though it was a very minor skirmish, was very significant because it's on the way to the Siege of Augusta, where they needed those supplies and they needed those people, you know, out of the way, so to speak. with their control of Fort Galphin. So Fort Galphin went down, returned to the Patriots, then Siege of Augusta, returned to the Patriots, and then 96 returned to the Patriots. So you can start to see that the Patriot forces are reclaiming a lot of the backcountry of South Carolina, even though the main port towns of Charleston and Savannah, for the most part, were still under British control. The last one I wanted to talk about was Johnstown. So what's interesting is that you'll note that the date of Johnstown, or what they call the Dean Swamp Skirmish, they don't even call it a skirmish, it was an interesting interaction. It occurs on May 24th, 1782, after Cornwallis has surrendered to George Washington in Battle of Yorktown. There's no internet back then. There's no news on 24-hour television. The people here didn't know that the war was over. So they're still fighting each other. And these again are patriots versus loyalists, neighbor versus neighbor. And so in this specific instance, on May 24, 1782, in Johnstown, or what we today would call Sally, there was a prison camp. And there was a prison camp that the loyalists held. Prison camp for loyalists. And some of the British citizens in the area were determined to free those loyalists. So they went to go free them and came up against some Patriot forces. There was a brief fighting. Two of the gentlemen with the Patriot forces passed away, and the retreat of the British soldiers occurred without freeing the prisoners. So it was a very quick sort of not really even battle, but sort of a trying to take on the loyalist camp. I thought this was kind of interesting. So again, they found the archaeological ruins of Fort Galphin. And by 1781, when it is Fort Galphin, becoming Fort Dreadnought, then becoming Fort Galphin again, George Galphin had actually passed away by that point. So he's no longer living, so his fort is being taken by British and Patriot forces. This was a drawing that was done in 1868 of the ruins of Fort Galphin. And Isabella Vandervelde, who's a local author and historian, actually drew what she thought Fort Galphin might have looked like. And this is what she drew. So it kind of gives you an idea. Remember how I said there was, on that 1775 map of our area, there was actually something that said the ruins of Fort Drake? That was right above where about I-20 hits the Savannah River now. This is what we're talking about when we talk about forts. They're basically house structures that have these palisades, sometimes maybe towers outside of them. They're fortified homes. And actually, the gentleman who owned Drake's Fort was William Drake. He later moved on to the upper area near 96 in Greenwood, abandoned his house near what today is North Augusta, and that was the ruins that was listed on the map. So fort is a glorified term for what we understand it today. Most of these backcountry forts were just fortified structures or fortified homes. So it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what it might have looked like. Now, I couldn't go without letting y'all know about the Martin sisters. So what I've told you up to now is mainly what I've read in books, I've read in resources, primary sources and things like this. This one borders on legend, but it's a legend that I love. So I think it's true. And they do say most legends start with a grain of truth. So I like to tell you the story of the Martin sisters. So we all drive up and down Martintown Road, yes? All right, one of the oldest roads in our area. It took people from the Beach Island, kind of Silver Bluff area, all the way up to 96. Martintown Road is named such because the family of Martin, who came here from Virginia in the 1740s, just like the Hammonds did and many others, who were second generation American or third generation American, they created basically a little town. It was a collection of buildings and structures. So town, again, is a little bit of a glorified term. But the Martin family, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your expertise, Jennifer, 7 sons? Okay, 7 sons and 1 daughter. And 6 of those sons fought? All of them.
Survived, only 1 son died.
1 son died in the Siege of Augusta. Yep. So Mrs. Martin, of course, is home, and she's at home. Her sons are all fighting. She's there with her daughter, and she's there with her daughters-in-law. So her sons had married, and their wives were staying with the family during the war. There were 2 or 3 that was involved in the next incident. Stories vary on who all was involved. But for the most part, they say Grace and Rachel were the ones involved. So the ladies knew in May of 1781, again, you have Augusta, which is under British control, and you have 96, which is under British control. And the British military officials are sending dispatches up and down Martintown Road, talking to each other about what's going on at their respective areas. The women know this, and one evening they dress in their husband's clothing, they get pistols from the family house, and they basically jump these British dispatchers who are running the messages. And so there's this great illustration that was done 50 years later, and it shows the two wives of the Martins basically grabbing the harnesses and stealing the dispatches from the British officers. And then, according to which story you've heard, either one of the sisters rides all night to 96 and turns over the dispatches to Colonel Nathaniel Greene on the Patriot side at 96, or they have a gentleman who lives nearby run the dispatches up to 96. And so I just love that these ladies took it into their own hands. They saw these dispatches going back and forth all the time, and they're like, I bet there's some important information that could help the Patriot side. So they basically dress in their husband's clothing, get some armaments, and then, bust up on these British soldiers. And I can just imagine going, hi-ya, give me the British, and the British guys are like, ah! And the legend is that supposedly the British officers, this is in the dead of night that they, or, towards the evening that they get jumped, and they trot up to the next house, which happens to be the Martin house. And supposedly by now the women have gotten back, they've changed back into their clothing, and the British officers come in, they're like, we were just jumped by like 20 guys, and they made off with their dispatchers, and they're like, oh, you poor thing, come on in, we'll give you some water, you poor baby. So, again, legend mixed in, but there's got to be a grain of truth to it. And in fact, today there is a chapter of the DAR in honor of the Martin sisters. So it's the Martintown chapter. Yeah. So, and you can still see the Martintown marker in downtown North Augusta, even though they technically were more towards like Edgefield. So sorry, Jennifer, we stole that one from Mel. Sorry. But I love it. It's this daring exploit of these women. So there were women and men fighting for the Patriot cause. The war ends. After losing Georgia, after losing South Carolina, the British rallied once more in Virginia. As we know, this is where the famous Battle of Yorktown occurs, from September 28th to October 19th of 1781. You have the Continental Army under George Washington, the British forces under General Cornwallis. 28,000 forces were engaged, 19,900 Patriot and 9,000 British come together to battle. That is when officially the war is come to a military end. Cornwallis has surrendered, but it would take another 2 years until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to officially end the war in legal terms with an agreement. I had to add one more story at the very end. So, have y'all ever heard the story of Hamburg, South Carolina? It's a little known aspect of North Augusta history. Real quick, in the simplest of terms that I can give you, there was a German immigrant named Henry Schultz. He came to Augusta, Georgia about 1803, 1805. He built a toll bridge from the South Carolina side to the Augusta, Georgia side, and made a lot of good money on the toll bridge. Through different machinations, he loses the toll bridge to the city of Augusta, and he becomes very bitter that Augusta stole his toll bridge. So he swears vengeance, economic vengeance. So he builds the town of Hamburg on the South Carolina side of the toll bridge and builds his own wharf with all of his own steamboats, so that all the South Carolina merchants who had previously been paying that toll to go across the bridge to Augusta to send their goods down the river via steamship, they now stop in Hamburg and they offload all their goods there. And Henry Schultz is like, ha ha, he basically is stealing all this trade from Augusta. Like I said, he's a very bitter, vengeful man. And so when finally in 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolution, decides to take his final tour of America, he comes to our area And who do you think gets him to come to his side before he goes to Augusta?
Can I give you a report?
Yeah?
Within the next, hopefully, 2 to 3 weeks, we have the sign that was donated to us by the Pomeroy Foundation. We will install a marker of Henry Schultz coming to North Augusta, to Hamburg.
Awesome. Very cool.
We have the sign.
Awesome. So Henry Schultz puts in his political handiwork and gets the Marquis de Lafayette to come to Hamburg first before he visits the city of Augusta. And as the Marquis de Lafayette is coming up to Hamburg, Henry Schultz's house is on a bluff that overlooks the Savannah River, which overlooks the town of Augusta. And Henry Schultz, of course being the patriot he is, sets off a cannon to basically signal welcome to the Marquis de Lafayette, and the cannon just happens to be pointed at Augusta. Whoops! So Henry Schultz gets his revenge by having the Marquis de Lafayette come to Hamburg first, have a grand party, and then go to Augusta next. But one final thing about Henry Schultz, again, very, very interesting gentleman. He finally dies in 1851, and his final request, supposedly, again, we can't prove it, but I like to think it's true. His final request is that he be buried standing straight up on his bluff with his backside to Augusta. We've never been able to prove it, but I like to think that he's still there today with his backside towards Augusta.
Is that where they get Schultz Hill?
Yes, ma'am, that's Schultz Hill. Yep. I thought again I would wrap up with a few of my resources. If you're interested in knowing more, SC250 website. Great website. It's going to tell you all the events that are going on in the area. The American Battlefield Trust. That's where I got a lot of my information about the battles. It's a great website. Wonderful national program. Library of Congress, of course, another great one. The South Carolina Department of Archives and History. SC Memory is another great one. SCETV's knowitall.org. The South Carolina Library. And just watch anything with Dr. Walter Edgar. He's amazing. He is like Professor Emeritus of South Carolina's history. And anything with Walter Edgar is just great. It's just aces. So with that, I hope I've given you a wonderful rundown of Aiken County and what we saw here happening during the American Revolution, especially in the way of battles and control and who fought whom and how it occurred and why it occurred. But if you have any questions, I will try to answer them, and if I don't know them, I'm going to point to Jennifer, and if she doesn't know them, then I have a business card, and I will email you what I find. So, are there any questions? Yes! All right, Jennifer, your turn. Oh, thank you. The floor is yours, madam.
On my petticoats to the front. Hey y'all, I am Jennifer Burkhalter. Y'all might know me as Jennifer Faircloth. My mom is Linda Campbell. My papa was John Henry. I never imagined I had somebody who would have fought in the American Revolution. I never imagined I could have been a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. But lo and behold, I am. And I have numerous ancestors. I got into genealogy just because as a child, it used to upset me that nobody could tell me who begot who, begot who, begot who. Like they could in the Bible. I couldn't get past well, I could go to Big Granny, so I could get to Daisy, Holly, but I couldn't go past that, and I was very disappointed in my mother for not keeping up with it. But I'm teaching her now. So, I joined the Daughters of the American Revolution. My ancestor is actually from South Carolina. His name is Catholic Corley, and he was out of 96 District. Since there's been a lot of changes, it's now called Saluda. So he was right up the road. Now, the way I'm related to him is actually through my granny Viola Faircloth, who was a Preston. So, looking at that tree, a lot of y'all, I know we're kin because all these people just stayed in the area and had more kids and they all married each other. Now, the best part about joining the Daughters of the American Revolution is if you don't know if you have an ancestor, we will help you find one. And there are a lot of chances to find one. There wasn't a lot of action going on, particularly in this area. However, our men and our women did a diligent job serving. Before the fall of the American Revolution, we found a lot of our patriots, what we call patriots with the DAR, were providing provisions. So they were sending food, they were sending cattle, they were sending supplies for the Continental troops. Now, when Charleston fell, when the British took over, all the Continental troops got locked up. So, you know, who's left to fight? All of us in the backcountry that were sending provisions. So my ancestor volunteered after the fall of Charleston, and he became a private. So after that, you get the Battle of Musgrove's Mill, Kings Mountain, what is it? Cowpens. What's the E-T, how you pronounce that? Yes. So all those were our little men. Those were our little sharpshooters. You know, them little country boys. And I laugh because they're like this guerrilla warfare. And I go, they were just hunting. That's all they were doing. They were just shooting at them like they would them squirrels. But we don't just honor actual patriot soldiers. So again, if that you gave provisions. So we have a lot of female patriots as well. We honor the Martin sisters. They are actually two women who we gave our patriot numbers to based on military service. It is documented. They captured, you know, those papers that they did get them sent to Nathaniel. The only part we can't prove is who carried them to him. But we do know, we're thinking one of the sisters, they say she rode a one-eyed donkey. But she could have rode it to the neighbor's house and gave him and had to go back home, because that would be a long way for a woman to go, knowing she had to get back to the house. And it was the neighbor versus neighbor. My Catholic Corley, he also had an uncle who was a loyalist. They called him Friar Nate, and a lot of times in Sally you'll hear about documents getting lost because of a fire, because he was the friar, so he was over the church, but it wasn't a fire. His house was burnt down on purpose because he was a loyalist. He stuck around. They all worked it out. He stayed and enjoyed that sweet liberty that he did not want to partake in to begin with. I love the DAR. I love history. I love Horse Creek. I love that mill. There's a lot of history in that mill. I'm researching that right now. I do believe that mill was providing provisions to our military while they were on their way to Silver Bluff as well. So I'm actually working on that for one of my projects. What else can I tell y'all about the DAR? Now what we do, we're a nonprofit, we're not a political group. We promote patriotism, education, and just, we're out here for community service. So that's all we do. Any funds we raise, you know, we use it for a project. We don't like to just raise money and sit on it. So we have a lot of female patriots. You could join with a female patriot. You could join with a male patriot. He could have been a soldier, or he could have just been, you know, sending supplies, or even hiding gunpowder in the woods, because we had a lot of that going on. It's really interesting. I'm going to touch on too about the Swiss colony. I'm a Burkhalter. My husband's a Burkhalter, so I'm not technically a Burkhalter. But all of the Swiss did not come over here legally. My husband's family ended up with the Swiss colony, but they snuck over. They didn't want to pay the tax that you had to pay to leave. So they snuck over here and got hooked back up with the colony, and then they reported them to the authorities. So the Swiss know that Michael Burkhalter was believed to be in the Carolinas. They charged him 90 pounds. And I told my husband, we're never going to be able to pay that back. So we're never going to travel. We're going to stay here. But we find all kinds of just really fun information like that, like with the Martins. You know, you grow up thinking it was all men, but it wasn't. Us women were holding down the home front. We are a national organization, so our headquarters is in Washington, D.C. If y'all watch The West Wing, a lot of that was filmed in our building. What I love most about our building is we have a great archives. If you're doing any kind of research, we have one of the top libraries. The Sons do not. I do like the Sons of the American Revolution. If it weren't for them, the Daughters would not have been formed. The Sons started Sons of the American Revolution, and they wouldn't let us join. So we started the Daughters of the American Revolution, and we've got a lot more nice stuff than they do. But we share and we work together. I was hoping I could get a guy to come with me, but we're kind of busy this month getting ready for all the celebrations coming up with America 250. We do have a Children of the American Revolution. So your grandkids can sign up, and we dress them up, and we teach them, and we drag them along everywhere, and turn them into history buffs, and then they grow up, and they love it, and they pass it on. Locally, I'm in the Trenton Chapter. I'm not in Trenton, South Carolina. We're actually in Aiken.
At this point, my battery camera died, and it was so late in the program that I didn't bother to replace that. If you're sitting at home and looking for things to do, consider joining a local historical society. There's always something going on and always places to visit and explore. You'd be surprised at how many historical properties there are in the area. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share.